I'm going to be reading today from Chapter 3 in the novel Alas, Babylon. Edgar Quisenberry, president of the bank, never lost sight of his position and responsibilities as sole representative of the national financial community in Fort Repose. A monolithic structure of Indiana limestone built by his father in 1920, the bank stood like a gray fortress at the corner of Yulee and St. John's. First National had weathered the collapse of the 1926 land boom, had been unshaken by the market crash of '29 and the depression that followed. The only person who ever succeeded in closing First National, Edgar often boasted, was Franklin D. Roosevelt in '33, and he had to shut down every other bank in the country to do it. It'll never happen again because we'll never have another SOB like him. Edgar, at 45, had grown to look something like his bank, squat, solid, and forbidding. He was the only man in Fort Repose who always wore a vest, and he never wore sport clothes, even on the golf links. Each year when he attended the Branch Federal Reserve Convention in Atlanta, 2 new suits were tailored, one double-breasted blue, one pinstripe gray, both designed to minimize or at least dignify what he called my corporation. First National employed 2 vice presidents, a cashier, an assistant cashier, and 4 tellers. But it was a one-man bank. You could put it in at any window, but before you took it out on loan or cashed an out-of-town check, you had to see Edgar. All Edgar's loans were based on character, and character was based on cash balance, worth of unencumbered real estate, ownership of bonds, and blue-chip stocks. Since Edgar was the only person in town who could and did maintain a mental index of all these variables, he considered himself the sole accurate judge of character. It was said that you could gauge a Grove owner's crop by the way Edgar greeted him on Yulee Street. If Edgar shook his hand and chatted, then the man had received a big price for his fruit. If Edgar spoke, cracked his face, and waved, the man was reasonably prosperous. If Edgar nodded but did not speak, nematodes were in the citrus roots. If Edgar did not see him, his grove had been destroyed in a freeze. So we just met another character, Edgar Quisenberry. He's the president of the Bank of Fort Repose, and as you can see by the descriptions that the author has attached to Edgar, he is big and foreboding like his bank, and he is overly concerned with wealth and money. When Randolph Bragg burst into the bank at 4 minutes to 3, Edgar pretended not to see him. His antipathy for Randy was more deeply rooted than if he had been a bankrupt. Bending over a desk as if examining a trust document, Edgar watched Randy scribble his name on the back of a check, smile at Mrs. Estes, the senior teller, and skid the check through the window. Randy's manner, dress, and attitude all seemed an affront. Randy had no respect for institutions, persons, or even money, and he would come bouncing in like this at the last minute and demand service as casually as if the bank were a soda fountain. As you're reading along, the bank is capitalized, and it's done so purposely so that it can symbolize Edgar's placing such importance on the Bank of Fort Repose and self-importance. He was a lazy, insolent oddball with dangerous political ideas who never made any effort to invest or save. Twice in the past few years he had overdrawn his account. People called the Braggs old family. Well, so were the Menorcans, old family, older, the descendants of Mediterranean islanders who had settled on the coast centuries ago. The Menorcans were shiftless no-goods, and the Braggs no better. Edgar disliked Randy for all these and another secret reason. Edgar saw Mrs. Estes open her cash drawer, hesitate, and speak to Randy. He saw Randy shrug. Mrs. Estes stepped out of the cage, and Edgar knew she was going to ask him to okay the check. When she reached his side, he purposely ignored her for a moment to let Randy know the bank considered him of little importance. Mrs. Estes said, "Will you initial this, please, Mr. Quisenberry?" Edgar held the check in both hands and at a distance, examining it through the bottom lens of his bifocals, as if it smelled of forgery. 5,000, signed by Mark Bragg. If Randy irritated Edgar, Mark infuriated him. Mark Bragg invariably and openly called him by his school nickname, Fisheye. He was glad that Mark was in the Air Force and rarely in town. Ask that young man to come here, he told Mrs. Estes. Perhaps now he would have the opportunity to repay Judge Bragg for the humiliation of the poker game. So, looks like Edgar has an axe to grind with Randy, Mark, and their father, Judge Bragg. 5 years before, Edgar had been invited to sit in the regular Saturday night pot limit game at the St. John's Country Club in San Marco, county seat and largest town of Timucuan. He had sat opposite Judge Bragg, a spare, straight older man. Except for a small checking account, the judge banked and did all of his business in Orlando and Tallahassee. So, Edgar hardly knew him at all. It sounds like Judge Bragg was onto something, huh? Edgar prided himself on his cagey poker. The idea was to win, wasn't it? Judge Bragg played an open, swashbuckling game as if he enjoyed it. On occasion he bluffed, Edgar deduced, but he seemed to be lucky, so it was difficult to tell whether he was bluffing or not. In the third hour, a big pot came along, more than $1,000. Edgar had opened with 3 aces and not bettered with his 2-card draw, and the judge had also drawn 2 cards. So, in this particular game of poker, each player is dealt 5 cards. After you've been dealt your 5 cards, you can choose any number of cards to discard in return for 2 new cards, or in return for new cards. Edgar and Judge Bragg both discarded 2 cards and got 2 new ones. After the draw, Edgar bet 100, and the men who had taken only 1 card dropped out, and that left it up to the judge. So, after new cards are dealt, the other men who were playing a part of the game folded. When you fold your hand, you just push your cards across the table, signifying you're out and you're resigning your game like you would in a game of chess. All the players have an opportunity to go out before they have to bet more money. Okay? And so Judge Bragg, it's left to Judge Bragg, and now he's got to decide, is he going to stay in and bet, or is he going to fold as well? The judge promptly raised the size of the pot. So, Edgar raised after getting his 2 new cards, and then the judge said, I'll see what you raised, Edgar, and I'm going to raise you an additional $100. And this was after the judge received 2 new cards. So, if you're thinking, why would he re-raise me? It may be because he got those 2 cards that he needed to give himself a better hand. Edgar hesitated, looked into the judge's amused, dark eyes, and folded. As the judge embraced and drew in the hill of chips, Edgar reached across the table and exposed his hand. 3 sevens and nothing else. So what Edgar just did is a cardinal sin in poker. If you fold and nobody else stays in the game, then the person, last man standing, is the one who gets to rake in all of the chips. And what Edgar did was he reached across the table and he exposed Judge Bragg's hand. And by doing so, he also exposed to everybody else at the table that Judge Bragg had been bluffing this entire time. And you have to pay to see. So if Edgar had wanted to see what Judge Bragg had, he would have had to have met Judge Bragg's re-raise. And he didn't want to do that. So he folded. He should have just pushed his cards across the table and let that be that. But no, he exposed Judge Bragg's cards, and that's a big no. Judge Bragg had said very quietly, "Don't ever touch my cards again, you son of a bitch. If you do, I'll break a chair over your head." 5 others in the game had waited for Edgar to do or say something, but Edgar only tried to laugh it off. At midnight, the judge cashed in his chips and said, "See you all next Saturday. If this tub of rancid lard isn't here, he's a bore, and he forgets to ante." This was the first and last time Edgar played at the St. John's Club, and he had never forgotten it. Randy walked into the bank's office enclosure, wondering why Edgar wanted to see him. Edgar knew perfectly well that Mark's check was okay. "What's the trouble, Edgar?" he asked. "Isn't it a little late to bring a big check in like this and ask us for cash?" The clock said 3:04. "It wasn't late when I came in," Randy said. He noticed other customers still in the bank: Eli Blostein, who owned Tropical Clothing, Pete Hernandez, Rita's older brother and manager of Ajax Supermarket, Jerry Kling from the Standard Station, Florence Wecheck with her Western Union checks and receipts. It was their custom to hurry to the bank just at 3. "It's all right for the business people to make their deposits after closing hour, but I think we ought to have more time to handle an item like this." Randy noticed that Florence, finished at the teller's window, had wandered within hearing. Florence didn't miss much. "How much time do you need to cash a check for $5,000? he asked. He was sure his face was reddening. He told himself he must not lose his temper. "That isn't the point," Edgar said. "The point is that your brother doesn't have an account here." "You don't doubt that my brother's check is good, do you?" Randy was relieved to find that his voice, instead of rising, sounded lower and steadier. And now, ladies and gentlemen, you are going to basically see a verbal match of poker where Randy bluffs Edgar. "No, I didn't say that. But it wouldn't be good banking procedure for me to hand you $5,000 and wait 4 or 5 days for it to clear all the way from Omaha. I endorsed it, didn't I?" Randy loosened his shoulders and flexed his toes and fingers and looked intently at Edgar's face. It would squash like a potato. "I doubt that your account would cover it." Randy's account stood below 400. This had been little to worry about, with his citrus checks due on the 1st of the year. Now, considering Mark's urgency, was dangerously low. He decided to probe Edgar's weakness. He said, "Penny wise, pound foolish. That's you, Edgar. You could have been in on a very good thing. Give me back the check. I'll cash it in San Marco or Orlando in the morning." Edgar realized that he must have made an error. It was most unusual for anyone to want $5,000 in cash. It indicated some sort of quick, profitable deal, and he should have found out why the cash was needed. "Now let's not be in a rush," he said. Randy held out his hand. "Give me the check." "Well, if I knew exactly why you had to have all this cash in such a hurry, I might be able to make an exception to banking rules. Come on, I don't have time to waste." Edgar's pale, protruding eyes shifted to Florence, frankly listening, and Eli Blostein hovering nearby, interested. "Come into my office, Randolph," he said. After Randy had the cash in hundreds, 20s, and 10s, he said, "Now I'll tell you why I wanted it, Edgar. Mark asked me to make a bet for him." "Oh, the races," Edgar said. "I very rarely play the races, but I know Mark wouldn't be risking that much money unless he had a sure thing. Running in Miami tomorrow, I suppose?" "No, not the races. Mark is simply betting that checks won't be worth anything very shortly, but cash will. Good afternoon, Fisheye." He left the office and sauntered across the lobby. Mic dropped. As Mrs. Estes unlocked the bank door, she squeezed his arm and whispered, "Good for you." Edgar rocked in his chair, furious. It wasn't a reason at all, it was a riddle. He repeated Randy's words. They made no sense at all, unless Mark expected some big cataclysm, like all the banks closing, and of course, that was ridiculous. Whatever happened, the country's financial structure was sound. Edgar reached a conclusion. He had been tricked and bluffed again. The Braggs were scoundrels, all of them. Randy's first stop was Ajax Supermarket. It really wasn't a supermarket as it claimed. Fort Repose's population was 3,422 according to the state census, and this included Pistolville and the Negro District. The Chamber of Commerce claimed 5,000, but later admitted counting the winter residents of the Riverside Inn and people who technically were outside the town limits, like those who lived on River Road. So Fort Repose had not attracted the big chain stores. Still, Ajax imitated the supermarkets inasmuch as you wheeled an aluminum cart around and served yourself, and Ajax sold the same brands at about the same prices. Randy hated grocery shopping. None of the elaborate surveys and studies in depth of buying habits of Americans had a classification for Randolph Bragg. He grabbed a cart and sprinted for the meat counter where he dropped a written order, and then he raced up and down aisles, snatching cans and bottles and boxes and cartons from shelves and freezers apparently at random, running down small children and bumping old ladies and apologizing until his final lap brought him back past the meat counter again. The butchers had learned to give his order priority, for if the meat wasn't cut up, he just didn't stop, simply made a violent U-turn and barreled off for the door. When the checker rang up Randy's bill, he looked at his watch. His record for a full basket was 3 minutes and 46 seconds, portal to portal. But on this day, it was entirely different because of the length of his list to which he had been adding, the quantities, and the Friday afternoon shopping rush. Now, I need you to think, what would you need in order to survive? This plays into part of the assignment that I gave you where you had to create like your top 10 survival list, what you would get, why you would need it, okay? Randy is shopping because a war is imminent. And because a war is imminent, he's trying to think of all of these things that he might possibly need. Right then, in the future, who knows how long the war may be going on. Think about it when we are preparing here in Miami for hurricane season, okay? You hear that a hurricane is coming, and what do? We go to the stores, we stock up on bottled water, we stock up on canned goods, we make sure that we have propane for our grills because we know that we're going to be possibly without power, okay? We make sure that we have can openers, all that sort of stuff, okay? We are prepared in some way, shape, or form for if we are going to be without power for a week or two, okay? Right now, we are in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, okay? And think about what people have been buying lots of: toilet paper, paper towels, hand sanitizer, okay? Bleach, disinfectant wipes. You can't find a disinfectant wipe in Dade County to save your life. Lysol, okay? You can scour Amazon, you're not gonna find anything, all right? So think about the things that even right here and now, we have been trying to procure in order to stay safe from the coronavirus, okay? So think about those things as Randy begins shopping for his brother's wife and his family. After he filled 3 carts and the meat order had already been carried to his car, he was still only halfway down his list, but physically and emotionally exhausted. His toes were mashed and he had been shoved, buffeted, butted in the ribs, and rammed in the groin. His legs trembled, his hands shook, and a tic had developed in his left eye. Waiting in the checkout line, maneuvering 2 top-heavy carts before and 1 behind, he cursed man's scientific devilishness inventing H-bombs and supermarkets, and cursed Mark, and swore he would rather starve than endure this ever again. At last he reached the counter. Pete Hernandez, acting as checker, gaped. "Good God, Randy," he said. "What are you going to do, feed a regiment?" Until the year before, Pete had always called him Mr. Bragg. But after Randy's first date with Pete's sister, their relationship naturally had changed. Mark's wife and children are coming to stay with me for a while, he explained. But she got a football team? Kids eat a lot, Randy said. Pete was skinny, chicken-breasted, his chin undershot, and his nails dirty, completely unlike Rita except for the black eyes and olive skin. Pete began to play the cash register with 2 fingers while the carboy awed, filled the big sacks. Randy was aware that 7 or 8 women lined up behind him counted his purchases, fascinated. He heard one whisper, 15 cans of coffee! 15! The line grew, and he was conscious of a steady, complaining murmur. Unaccountably, he felt guilty. He felt that he ought to face these women and shout, all of you, buy everything you can. But it wouldn't do any good. They would be certain that he was mad. Pete pulled down the total and announced it loudly. $314.80, Randy. Geez, that's our record. From habit, Randy looked at his watch. 1 hour and 6 minutes. That too was a record. He paid in cash, grabbed an armful of bags, nodded for Pete's carboy to follow, and fled. So I know that Randy just paid over $300 for groceries, and in this day and age, a family of 4 might spend $500 on grocery. But as I'm going to remind you, think of the time period in which the book is set in, and during this time period, $316 is definitely an exorbitant amount spent on groceries. He stopped at Bill Cullen's bar, short order grill, package store, and fish camp just outside the town limits. There was space for 2 cases in the front seat, so he'd lay in his whiskey supply. Bill and his wife, a straw-haired woman, usually groggy and thick-tongued with spiked wine, operated all this business in a 2-room shack joined to a covered wharf, its pilings leaning and roof askew in a cove on the Timaquan. The odors of fried eggs, dead minnows, gasoline and kerosene fumes, decaying gar and catfish heads, stale beer and spilt wine oozed across land and water. Sounds like a truly enchanting place. Ordinarily, Randy bought his bourbon 2 or 3 bottles at a time, but in this day, he bought a case and a half, cleaning out Bill's supply of his brand. He recalled that Helen, when she drank at all, preferred scotch, and he bought 6/5 of scotch. Bill, inquisitive, said, "Planning a big barbecue or a party or something, Randy? You figure you'll try politics again?" Randy found it almost impossible to lie. His father had beaten him only once in his life when he was 10, but it had been a truly terrible beating. He had lied, and the judge had gone upstairs and returned with his heaviest razor strop. He had grabbed Randy by the neck and bent him across the billiard table and implanted the virtue of truth through the seat of his pants and on bare hide until he screamed in terror and pain. Then Randy was ordered to his room, supperless and in disgrace. Hours later, the judge knocked and came in and gently turned him over in the bed. The judge spoke quietly. Lying was the worst crime, the indispensable accomplice of all others, and would always bring the worst punishment. "I can forgive anything except a lie." Randy believed him. And while he could no longer remember the lie that he had told, he never forgot the punishment. Unconsciously, his right hand rubbed his buttocks as he thought up an answer for Bill Cullen. "I'm having visitors," Randy said, "and Christmas is coming." And this was the truth, if not the whole truth. He couldn't risk saying more to Bill. Bill's nickname was Big Mouth, and his lying not limited to the size of yesterday's catch. Big Mouth Bill could spark a panic. When he turned into the driveway, Randy saw Malachi Henry using a scuffle hoe in the camellia bed screening the garage. "Malachi," he called, "how about helping me get this stuff into the house?" Malachi hurried over. His eyes, widening, took in the cartons, bags, and cases filling the trunk and piled on the seats. "All this going up to your apartment, sir?" "No, it goes into the kitchen and utility room. Mrs. Bragg and the children are flying in from Omaha tomorrow." As they unloaded, Randy considered the Henrys. They were a special problem. They were black and they were very poor, but in many ways closer to him than any family in Fort Repose. They owned their own land and ran their own lives, but in a sense, they were his wards. They could not be abandoned or the truth withheld from them. He couldn't explain Mark's warning to Missouri. She wouldn't understand. If he told Preacher, all Preacher would do was lift up his face, raise his arms, and intone, "Hallelujah, the Lord's will be done." If he told Two-Tone, Two-Tone would consider it an excuse to get drunk and stay that way. But he could with confidence tell Malachi. With the meat packed in the freezer and everything else stacked in cupboards and closets, Randy said, "Come on up to my office, Malachi, and I'll give you your money." He paid Malachi $25 a week for 20 hours. Malachi picked his own days to mow, rake, fertilize, and trim, days when he had no fruit picking, repairing, or better paying yard jobs elsewhere. Randy knew he was never short-timed, and Malachi knew he could always count on that 25 a week. Malachi's face was expressionless, but Randy sensed his apprehension. Malachi never before had been asked upstairs to receive his pay. In the office, Randy dropped into the high-backed, leather-covered swivel chair that had come from his father's chambers. Malachi stood uncertain. "Sit down," Randy said. Malachi picked the least comfortable straight chair and sat down, not presuming to lean back. Randy brought out his wallet and looked up at the portrait of his bald-headed grandfather, Woodrow Wilson's diplomat, with the saying for which he was known stamped in faded gold on the discolored frame. Small nations, when treated as equals, become the firmest of allies. It was difficult. From the days when they fished and hunted together, he had always felt close to Malachi. They could still work in the grove side by side and discuss as equals the weather and the citrus and the fishing, but never any longer share any personal, any important matters. They could not talk politics or women or finances. It was strange, since Malachi was much like Sam Perkins. He had as much native intelligence as Sam, the same intuitive courtesy, and they were the same size, weighing perhaps 180, and the same color, cordovan brown. Randy and Sam Perkins had been lieutenants in a company of the 7th Custer Regiment of the 1st Cavalry. Together, Randy and Sam had dug in on the banks of the Han and the Chongchan and faced the bugle-heralded human wave charge at Onsan, and covered each other's platoons in advance and retreat. They had slept side by side in the same bunker, eaten from the same mess tins, drunk from the same bottle, flown to Tokyo and R&R together, and together bellied up to the bar of the Imperial Hotel. They had even gone to a junior officer grade geisha house together and been greeted with equal hospitality and favors. So it was a strange thing that he could not speak to Malachi, whom he had known since he could speak at all, as he had to Sam Perkins in Korea. It was strange that a Negro could be an officer and a gentleman and an equal below parallel 38, but not below the Mason-Dixon line. It was strange, but this was not the time for social introspection. His job was to tell Malachi to brace and prepare himself and his family. So, Randy knows that the Henrys are basically his ward, meaning he needs to take care of them and look out for them. And by looking out for them, he needs to tell them that a war is imminent and that they need to prepare. Randy chooses to tell Malachi because he feels that he is the one who would understand it the most. Randy then takes this little bit of time to reflect and think, my God, it's so crazy that I served in a war with Sam Perkins and we could talk about anything and we had each other's backs no matter what happened. And it's strange for me to even at this point in time invite Malachi into my house, even though I've known him since I was a child. It is because, look at the time period where we are, okay? Look at the location. It is in central Florida, okay? There was still segregation going on. There were still racial tensions. There are still racial tensions today, but it was much worse a long time ago. And blacks and whites could not mix together. And he's saying, in reference to parallel 38, that is the parallel on the map of the world that divides North and South Korea. So they could be friends on the 38th parallel, but he could not be friends with Malachi in his own state because it is south of the Mason-Dixon line. And the Mason-Dixon line is the line that divides North and South. Blacks are just treated poorly for no reason other than the color of their skin. And Randy recognizes this is wrong, and he still can't do anything about it. Randy took 2 10s and a 5 from his wallet and shoved them across the desk. That's for the week. Thank you, sir, Malachi said, folding the bills and tucking them into the breast pocket of his checked shirt. Perhaps the difference was that Malachi had not been an officer like Sam Perkins, Randy thought. Malachi had been in the service for 4 years, but in the Air Defense Command, a tech sergeant babying jet engines. Perhaps it was their use of the language. Sam spoke crisp New York, Cornell English, but when Malachi talked, you didn't have to see him to know that he was black. Malachi, Randy said, I want to ask you a serious question. Yes, sir. What would you say if I told you that I had very good information, about as good as you can get it, that before long a war is coming? It wouldn't surprise me one bit. The answer surprised Randy. His swivel chair banged upright. What makes you say that? Malachi smiled, pleased with Randy's reaction. Well, sir, I keep up with things and I read all I can. I read all the news magazines and all the out-of-state papers I can get a hold of, and some service journals and lots of other stuff. You do? You don't subscribe to all of them, do you? Malachi tried to control his grin. Some I get from you, Mr. Randy. You finish a magazine and throw it away, and Missouri finds it and brings it home in her tote bag. And every day she collects the Cleveland papers and the business magazines from Mrs. McGovern's. Mondays I work for Admiral Hazard. He saves the New York Times and the Washington papers for me, and the Naval Institute proceedings, and technical magazines, and I listen to all the commentators. How do you find the time? Randy had never realized that Malachi read anything except the San Marcos Sun, where it shines for Temecula County. Well, sir, there's not much for a single non-drinking man to do around Fort Repose weeknights. So I read and I listen. I know things ain't good, and the way I figure that if people keep piling up bombs and rockets higher and higher and higher, some days somebody's gonna set one off, and then bluey. More than one, Randy said, and soon, maybe very soon. That's what my brother believes, and that's why he's sending Mrs. Bragg and the children down here. You better get set for it, Malachi. That's what I'm doing. Malachi's smile was gone entirely. Mr. Randy, I've thought about it a lot, but there's not a doggone thing we can do about it. We just have to sit here and wait for it. There's not much we can lay up. He patted his breast pocket. This $25 with what Missouri brings home this evening is it. Fast as we make it, it goes. Of course, we don't need much, and we've got one thing hardly anybody else has got. What's that? Water. Running water. Artesian water that can't be contaminated. You all only use it in the sprinkling system because it smells funny. Some say like rotten eggs. But that sulfur water ain't bad. You gets to like it. Till that moment, Randy hadn't thought of water at all. His grandfather, in a year of a freakish drought, at great cost, had drilled nearly 1,000 feet to find the artesian layer and irrigate the grove. And his grandfather had allowed the Henrys to tap the main pipe. So the Henrys had a perpetual flow of free water, although it was hard with dissolved minerals, and Randy hated to taste it out of the sprinkler heads in grove and garden, even on a hot summer day. I'm afraid I'll never get used to it, he said. He counted out $200 in 20s and thrust the money across the desk. This is for an emergency. Buy what you need. The new notes felt slippery in Malachi's fingers. I don't know when I can pay this back. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to ask you to pay it back. Malachi folded the bills. Thank you, sir. See you next week, Malachi. Malachi left and Randy mixed a drink. He turned the tap and lo, water came forth, sweet, soft water without odor, pumped from subsurface pool by a silent, faithful servant, a small electric motor. Every family on River Road, except the Henrys, obtained its water in the same way, each with its own pump and well. More important than anything he had listed was water, free of dangerous bacilli, unpolluted by poisons, human, chemical, or radioactive. Pure water was essential to his civilization, accepted like pure air. In the big cities, where even a near miss would rupture reservoirs, this is definitely foreshadowing, folks, demolish aqueducts and smash mains, it would be hell without water. Big cities would become traps, deadly as deserts or jungles. Randy began to consider how little he really knew of the fundamentals of survival. Helen, he guessed, would know a great deal more. It was a required subject in the education of Air Force wives. He decided he would talk to Bubba Offenhouse, who ran civil defense in Port Repose. Bubba must have pamphlets or something he could study. Downstairs, Graff began to bark an insistent, belligerent alarm announcing a strange car in the driveway. Randy went to the head of the stairs and shouted, "Shut up, Graff!" and waited to see who would knock. Nobody knocked, but the door opened and Randy saw Elizabeth McGovern in the front hall, bending over Graff, her face curtained by shoulder-length blonde hair. She stroked Graff's hackles until his tail wig-wagged a friendly signal. Then she looked up and called, "You decent, Randy?" One day she would barge in like this and he would be indecent. She bewildered him. She was brash, unpredictable, and sometimes uncomfortably outspoken. "Coming up, Lib," he said. Like the Henrys, she was a special problem. All through the summer and early fall, Randy had watched the McGovern house and dock go up. While landscapers spotted palms in orderly rows, laid down turf, and planted flower pots and shrubbery, on a sultry October afternoon, trolling for bass in the channel, he had seen a pair of faultlessly curved and tapered legs incongruously stretched toward the sky from the McGovern dock. Since she was lying on the canvas-covered planking, heels propped up on a post, the legs were all that could be seen from the water level. He turned the prow toward shore to discover whose body was attached to those remarkable and unfamiliar legs. When his boat was almost under the dock, he'd spoken, "Hello, legs." "You may call me Lib," she said. "You're Randy. Randy Bragg, aren't you? I've sort of been expecting you'd call." When they had become something more than friends, although less than lovers, he'd accused her of luring him with her lovely legs. Lib laughed and said, "I didn't know then that you were a leg man, but I'm glad you are. Most American males have a fixation about the mammary gland, a symptom of mommyism, I think. Legs are for men's pleasure, breast for babies." "Oh, that's really sour grapes. I only said it because I know my legs are my only real asset. I'm flat and I'm not pretty." And technically she was accurate. She was no classic beauty when you considered each feature individually. She was only beautiful in complete design, in the way she moved and was put together. She came up the stairs and curled a bare arm around his neck and kissed him. A brief kiss, a greeting. "I've been trying to get you on the phone all day," she said. "I've been thinking and I've reached an important conclusion." "Where have you been?" "My brother stopped at McCoy, flying back to Omaha, and I had to meet him." He led her into the living room. "Drink?" "Ginger ale, if you have it." She sat on a stool at the bar, one knee raised and clasped between her hands. She wore a sleeveless turquoise linen blouse, doeskin shorts, and moccasins. He tumbled ice into a glass and poured ginger ale and said, What's this important conclusion? You'll get mad. It's about you. Okay, I'll get mad. I think that you ought to go to New York or Chicago or San Francisco or any city with character and vitality. You should go to work. This place is no good for you, Randy. The air is like soup and people are like noodles. You're vegetating, and I don't want a vegetable, I want a man. He was instantly angry, and then he told himself that for a number of reasons, including the fact that her diagnosis was probably the truth, it was silly to be angry. He said, "If I went away and left you here, wouldn't you turn into a noodle? I thought it all out. As soon as you get a job, I'll follow you. If you want, we can live together for a while. If it's good, we can get married." So, Lib is basically forcing Randy to confront some truths that he doesn't want to confront. And she sees that deep down inside, Randy is unhappy living in Fort Repose. And it is because he feels unfulfilled. It's not that he's not happy with Lib. He is happy with Lib. But he is unfulfilled with his occupation, with the direction that his life is taking. And if you think back to the beginning of the book, remember I had said all of the men in his family had been very successful. And then we get to Randy, and while he is a lawyer, he is a failed politician. He was beaten by Porky Logan. And I think Lib recognizes all of this and really is trying to push Randy to leave and go seek a better life elsewhere. He examined her face. Her mouth, usually agile and humorous, was drawn into a taut, colorless line. Her eyes, which reflected her moods as the river reflected the sky, were gray and opaque. Under the soft tan painted by winter's sun, her skin was pale. She was serious. She meant it. "Too late," he said. "What do you mean, too late?" Yesterday, there may have been sense and logic to her estimate, and he might have accepted this challenge, invitation, and proposal. But since morning, they had lived in diverging worlds. It was necessary that he lead her down into his world, yet not too abruptly, lest sight and apprehension of the future imperil her capacity to think clearly and act intelligently. "My sister-in-law and her 2 children are coming to stay with me," he began. "They get in tonight. In the morning, really, 3:30. "Fine," she said. "Meet them. Turn the house over to them, and then pick yourself a city. A nice, big, live city. They can have this place all to themselves, and while they're here, you won't have to worry about the house." "How long are they staying?" "I don't know," Randy said. "Maybe forever," he almost added, but didn't. "It won't matter, really, will it? When they leave, you can rent the house, and if they leave soon, you ought to get a good price for it for the rest of the season. What's your sister-in-law like?" "I haven't told you the reason they're coming." He reached out and covered her hands. Her fingers, long, round, strong, matched her throat. Her nails were tinted copper and carefully groomed, and he tried to frame the white words. "My brother believes." Graff, lying near Randy's stool, rolled to his feet, hair bristling like a razorback pig, tail and ears at attention, and then raced into the hallway and down the stairs, barking wildly. "That's the loudest dog I've ever met," Lib said. "What's eating him now?" "He's got radar ears. Nothing can get close to the house without him knowing." Randy went downstairs. It was Dan Gunn at the door. An angular, towering man, sad-faced and Saturn, wearing heavy-framed glasses, awkward in the movement and sparing of speech. He stepped into the hallway, not bothering to glance at Graff. Dan said, "You got a woman upstairs, Randy?" "I know you have, because her car is in the driveway." He removed his pipe from his mouth and almost smiled. "I'd like to talk to her about her mother and her father, too." "Come on up to the apartment, Dan," Randy said. "I'll just wander around in the yard." He guessed that Dan had just come from a professional visit to the McGoverns. Lib's mother had diabetes. He didn't know what her father had, but if Dan was going to discuss family illness with Lib, he would politely vanish. "I don't think Elizabeth will mind if you sit in on this," Dan said. "Practically one of the family by now, aren't you?" Going upstairs, Randy decided that Dan too should know of Mark's warning. If anybody ought to know, it was a doctor. And at the same time, Randy realized that he had not included drugs in his list, and the medicine cabinet held little except aspirin, nasal sprays, and mouthwash. With 2 children coming, he should have planned better than that. Anyway, Dan was the man to tell him what to get and write the prescriptions. Randy mixed Dan a drink and said, "Our medic is here to see you, Lib, not me. And when he's finished talking, I've got something to say to both of you." Dan looked at him oddly. "Sounds like you're about to make a big pronouncement." "I am, but you go first." "It's nothing urgent or terribly important. I was just making the placebo circuit and dropped in to see Elizabeth's mother." "The what?" Lib asked. Randy had heard Dan use the phrase before. "Placebo, or psychosomatic circuit. The middle-aged retirees and geriatrics who have nothing to do but get lonely and worry about their health. The only person they can call who can't avoid them is their doctor. So they call me, and I let them bend my ear with symptoms, and I give them sugar pills or tranquilizers. One seems to do about as good as the other, and I tell them that they're going to live. And this makes them happy. I don't know why." So a placebo is basically a fake pill that Dan gives to some of his patients because if he gives them this pill and he says you're going to be okay, then that lulls them into feeling secure. At 35, Dan was a souring idealist. After medical school in Boston, he'd started practice in a Vermont town and in his free hours slaved at postgraduate studies in epidemiology. His target had been the teeming continents and the great plagues: malaria, typhus, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and he was angling for a World Health Organization or Point 4 appointment. Then he'd married. His wife, Randy, did not know her name because Dan had never uttered it. Apparently had been extravagant, a nympho, a one-drink alcoholic, and a compulsive gambler. She had recoiled at the thought of living in equatorial Africa or a delta village in India, and had pestered him to set up practice in New York or Los Angeles where the big money was. When Dan refused, she took to spending weekends in New York, an easy pickup at her favorite bar in the 50s. So he'd been a gentleman and let her go to Reno and get the divorce. When her luck ran out, she returned east, filed suit for alimony, and the judge had given her everything she had asked. Now she lived in Los Angeles and each week shoveled the alimony into bingo games or parimutuel machines. And Dan's career was ended before it had begun. A World Health or Point 4 salary would barely pay her alimony and leave nothing for him. And a doctor can't skip, except into the medical shadowland of criminal practice. He had come to Florida because the state was growing and his practice and fees would be larger, and he thought that he could eventually accrue enough money to offer her a cash settlement and suture his financial hemorrhage. In Fort Repose, Dan shared the one-story medical arts building with an older man, Dr. Bloomfield, and 2 dentists. He lived frugally in a 2-room suite in the Riverside Inn, where he acted as house physician for the aging guests during the winter season. His gross income had doubled, and while he delivered babies for the Pistolville and Negro families for $25, he balanced this with $10 house calls on the placebo circuit. In a single 2-hour sweep up River Road, handing out placebos and tranquilizers, he often netted $100. But it did him no good. He discovered that he was inexorably squeezed between alimony and taxes. Taxes rose with income, and the escalator clause in his alimony order took effect. Once, he and Randy figured out that if his gross rose to more than $50,000 a year, he would have to go into bankruptcy. Dan could imagine no combination of circumstances that would allow him to amass enough capital to buy off his former wife and set him free to fight the plagues. So he was a bitter man, but Randy believed a kind man, perhaps even a great one. So the major source of Dan's disappointment is his occupation. He's a doctor, and he's wanted to be a doctor, but he doesn't want to be the kind of doctor that he is right now. He wanted to be in a third world country, helping solve diseases, helping find cures, and that's not where he wound up. And he's in the situation that he's in because he married a woman who divorced him and basically took him to the cleaners. So Dan is divorced, he's stuck in a job that he does not like, and he sees no way out from this life at this point in time. It's like Groundhog Day. Every day he gets up and it's the same thing. We're like a hamster on a wheel. It never changes. And that is why he is so unhappy. Lib said, "You don't consider our house a stop on the placebo circuit, do you?" "No," Dan said, "and yes, your mother does have diabetes." He paused to let her understand that was not all that was wrong. "She called me today and she was very upset. She wondered whether she could change from insulin to the new oral drug. You've been giving her insulin shot every morning, haven't you?" "Yes," Lib said. "She can't bear to stick herself and she won't let my father do it. She says he's too rough. Says Dad jabs her like he enjoys it." This was something Randy hadn't known before. Dan said, "She wants me to get her Oronase because she says you're talking about leaving her." Lib said, "Yes, I do intend to leave, and I'm going to leave when Randy leaves." Randy started to speak, but checked himself. He could wait a moment. Dan wiped his glasses. His face dropped unhappily. "I don't know about experimenting," he said. "Your mother is balanced at 70 units of insulin a day, pretty solid shot. I don't want to take her off insulin, and she'll have to learn to use the hypodermic herself. Now, let's move on to your father." "My father? Nothing's wrong with Dad, is there?" "Maybe nothing, maybe everything." "He's turning into a zombie, Elizabeth. Doesn't he have any hobbies? Can't he start a new business? He's only 61, and except for a little hypertension, in good shape physically, but he's dying faster than he should. The better a man is at business, the worse in retirement. One day he's running a big corporation, and the next day he isn't allowed to run anything, even his own house. And he wishes himself dead and he dies." Lib had been listening intently. She said, "It's even harder on Dad. You see, he didn't retire by choice, he was fired. Oh, we call it retirement, and he gets his pension, but the board eased him out. He lost a quiet little proxy fight. And now, he doesn't think he is of any use to anyone at all." "I felt," Dan said, "it was something like that." He was silent a moment. "I'd like to help him. I think he's worth saving." Now Randy knew it was time to speak. "When you came in, Dan, I was about to tell Lib what Mark told me today, out at McCoy. He's afraid. He's sure that we are on the verge of war. That's why Helen and the children are being sent down here. Mark thinks the Russians are already staged for it." Randy watched them. Comprehension seemed to come first to Elizabeth. She said softly, "Oh, God," and her fingers locked in her lap and grew white. Dan's head shook a negative tremor, and he looked at the decanter and Randy's half-empty glass on the bar. "You haven't been drinking, have you, Randy?" "First today, since breakfast." "I didn't think you'd been drinking. I was just hoping." Dan's massive head with the coarse, wiry, reddish hair at the temples bent forward as if his neck could no longer support it. "I guess that makes everything hypothetical," he said. "How soon?" "Mark doesn't know, and I can't even guess. Today, tomorrow, next week, next month, you name it." Lib looked at her watch. "News at 6, she said. Our portable radio, no larger than a highball glass, stood at the end of the bar, and she turned it on. "I want you to pay attention to this radio broadcast, because there's one little blurb in the radio broadcast about what's going on in the world, and it is sandwiched literally between weather and an update on a fishing tournament. I would think, or one would think, that if we were on this close of a cusp or on the verge of war, that there might be a more sense of urgency." Randy kept the portable tuned to WSMF, wonderful San Marco, Florida, the biggest station in the county, and the dance music faded, and the voice of Happy Hendricks, the disc jockey, said, Well, all of you frozen felines have got to take the needle out of the groove for 5 minutes so the cubes, a cube is a square any way you look at them, can get hit with what cooks around the sphere. So let's start in with the weather. It's 69 outside our studios right now, and the forecast for Central Florida is fair and mild with light to moderate east winds tomorrow, and no frost danger through Tuesday. That's good fishing weather, folks, and to prove it, here's a story from Tavares over in Lake County. Jonas Corkle of Hyannis, Nebraska, today caught a 13-pound, 4-ounce big mouth in Lake Dora to take the lead in the Lake County's winter bass tournament. He used a black eel bait. A UP item for Washington says the Navy has ordered preventative action against 6 unidentified jet planes which have been shadowing the Sixth Fleet in the eastern Mediterranean. At Tropical Park today, Bald Eagle won the Coral Handicap by 3 lengths, paying $11.60. Careless Lady was second and Rumpus third. Now, turning up news of Wall Street, stocks closed mixed with missiles up and railroads off. In moderate trading, the Dow Jones averages. Lib turned off Happy Hendricks. She said, "What's it mean?" Randy shrugged. "That business in the Mediterranean, it's happened before. I guess that's one of the dangerous things about it. We get shockproof. We've been conditioned. Standing on the brink of war becomes our normal posture." He turned to Dan. "I think we should lay into some drugs, an emergency kit. How about prescribing for war, doctor?" Dan fumbled in his jacket pocket and brought out a pad. He moved slowly and seemed very tired. "I'll give you both some," he said, starting to write. "Stuff you can use yourselves without my help. And for your mother, Elizabeth, extra bottles of insulin, and I'll also order some Oronase from a drug house in Orlando. Local pharmacy doesn't carry it yet." "I thought you'd decided not to experiment with it on Mother," Lib said. "Insulin," Dan said, continuing to write, "requires refrigeration." Dan dropped the prescriptions on the bar. "Good night," he said. "I'm delivering a baby at the clinic at 7, cesarean section. Life goes on, and that's what I'm going to believe until proved otherwise." He rose and shambled out of the room. Lib walked around the counter. "Hold me," she said. Randy held her, crushed her, strangely without any passion except fear for her. Usually he only had to feel her body or brush his lips across her hair and smell what she called my courting perfume to become aroused. But now his arms were completely encircling and completely protective. All he asked was that she live and he live and that things remain the same. She kept rolling her smooth head against his throat, and she was saying no to it. She was willing and praying the clock to stand still as Randy was. But as Mark said, this was against nature. She raised her head and gently pushed herself away and said, "Thanks, Randy. I get strength from you. Did you know that? Now, tell me what I should do." "You better drive back to your house and speak with your mother and father." "I don't think they'll believe it. They don't pay much attention to the international situation, and Mother doesn't even like to talk about anything unpleasant." "They probably won't believe it. After all, they don't know Mark. Put it up to your father as a business proposition. Tell him it's like taking out insurance. Anyway, be sure and get Dan's prescriptions filled." "I'll get the medicines tomorrow," she said. "Food isn't a problem. Our cupboard isn't exactly bare." "What are you going to do, Randy? Hadn't you better get some rest if you have to be at the airport at 3:30? "I'll try." He took her into his arms again and kissed her, this time not feeling protective at all, and she responded, her fears contained. They left the house as the distended red run dropped into the river where it joined the wide St. John's. She got into the car. He touched her lips again. "If you need me, call." "Don't worry, I will. See you tomorrow, Randy." "Yes, tomorrow." Now, look at this hour, when the cirrus clouds stretched like crimson ribbons high across the southwest sky in such a hush that not even a playful eddy dared stir moss or palm fronds. The day died in calm and in beauty. This was Randy's hour, this and dawn, time of stillness and of peace. His eye was attracted by a movement in a clump of Turk's cap across the road, and then again he saw that damn bird. There could be little doubt of it. Even at this distance, without binoculars, he could distinguish the white-rimmed eyes. Moving very slowly and in silence, drifting from bush to bush, he crossed the lawn. If he could cross the road and Florence Weecheck's front yard without frightening it, he might make a positive identification. Florence and Alice Cooksey watched him. Florence had been observing him from behind the bedroom blinds while he talked with the McGovern girl and kissed her goodbye. Disgusting public exhibition. Now who's spying on who? She had watched him stand in the doorway, hands on hips, alone, and for a long time, motionless. And then, incredulously, she had seen him bend over and stealthily move toward her, and she had called to Alice. "There he is," she said triumphantly. "I told you so. Come and see for yourself. He's a peeping Tom, all right." Alice, peering through the louver, said, "I think he's stalking something." "Yes, me!" They watched while he crossed the road, placing his feet carefully as a heron feeding on minnows in the shallows. "The sneak," Florence said. He reached Florence's lawn and for a moment hid behind a clump of boxwood. "He's going around the side of the house," Florence said. "I think we can watch him better from the dining room." And she ran into the dining room. Alice followed. Bent almost double, he advanced from the boxwood toward the Turk's cap. Suddenly he straightened, threw an imaginary hat to the ground, and Florence heard him say distinctly, "Oh, God damn." At the same time, she heard Anthony shaking the cage on the back porch. Anthony had come home for the night. Then she heard Randy on the back porch. Anthony squawked, Randy swore, and shouted, "Hey, Florence!" She opened the kitchen door and said, "Now look here, Randolph Bragg. I am not having any more of your prowling around the house and staring at me while I'm dressing. You ought to be ashamed." Randy, mouth open, astonished, stared at the two birds, Anthony on the outside of the cage, Cleo fluttering within. He said, "Is that your bird?" He pointed at Anthony. "Certainly it's my bird." "What kind of bird is it?" "Why, it's an African lovebird, of course." Randy shook his head. "I'm a dope. I thought he was a Carolina parakeet. You know, the Carolina parakeet is, or was, our only native parrot, and a specimen hasn't been identified since 1925. They're supposed to be extinct. That isn't one I'm willing to admit they are." "Is that why you've been spying on me? I saw you at it this morning with glasses." "I haven't been spying on you, Florence. I've been spying on that fake Carolina parakeet." He noticed Alice Cooksey standing behind Florence, smiling. Alice was one of his favorite people. He ought to tell Alice about Mark and what Mark had predicted. Ought to tell Florence as well. But Florence still looked upset and angry, and he said, "Now, Florence, cool off. I've got something important to tell you." "Bird watcher!" Florence shrieked. She slammed the kitchen door in his face and fled into the house. Randy put his hands in his pockets and strolled home. The world was real crazy. He talked to Florence and Alice in the morning after Florence settled down. In his kitchen, Randy made himself a cannibal sandwich. Lib considered his habit of eating raw, ground round, smeared with horseradish and mustard and pressed between slices of rye bread, barbarous. He had explained it was simply a bachelor's meal, quick and lazy, and anyway he liked it. He trotted downstairs and examined the purchases lined on shelves and stacked in closets. Some of it was pretty exotic stuff for an emergency. Perhaps he should make up a small kit of delicacies. If the worst happened, this would be their iron rations for a desperate time, and if nothing happened, it would all keep. He selected a jar of English beef tea, a sealed package of bouillon cubes, a jar of Swiss chocolates and sealed tin of hard candies, a canned Italian cheese, and a few other small items. He placed them all in a small carton, wrapped the carton in foil, and took it up to the apartment. The teak chest in the office was a fine place to hide it and forget it. He rummaged through the chest, rearranging old legal documents, abstracts, bundles of letters, a packet of Confederate currency, peeling photograph albums, Lieutenant Payton's log, and a half a dozen baby books. All family memorabilia, judged not valuable enough to warrant safe space in a deposit vault, but too valuable to be thrown away, and made space for the iron rations at the bottom. At 7 o'clock, he listened to the news. There was nothing startling. He flopped down on a studio couch, picked up a magazine, and started to read an article captioned, "Next Stop, Mars." Presently, the words danced in front of his eyes, and he slept. Now, this next part that I'm going to read to you is a lot of military mumbo-jumbo. And again, remember, I told you that the writer, the author of the book, purposely did this so as to make us civilians feel exactly like we don't know really what's going on. And it's intended to do this. When it was 7 Friday evening in Fort Repose, it was 2 o'clock Saturday morning in the eastern Mediterranean, where Task Group 6.7 turned toward the north and headed for the narrow seas between Cyprus and Syria. The shape of the task group was a giant oval, its periphery marked by the wakes of destroyers and guided missiles, frigates, and cruisers. And the center of Task Group 6.7, and the reason for its existence, was the USS Saratoga, a mobile nuclear striking base. In Saratoga's Combat Information Center, 2 officers watched a bright blip on the big radar repeater. It winked on and off like a green eye, opening and closing. Interrogated by a friend or foe radar impulse. It had not replied. It was hostile. For 36 hours, ever since passing Malta, Saratoga had been shadowed. The blip was the latest shadower. One of the officers said, "No use in sending up a night fighter. That bogey is too fast. But an F-11F could catch him. So we'll let him hang around, let him close in. Maybe he'll come in close enough for a missile shot from Canberra. If not, we'll launch F-11Fs at first light." The other officer, an older man, a senior captain, frowned. He disliked risking his ship in an area of restricted maneuver while under enemy observation. He always thought of the Mediterranean as a sack, anyway, and they were approaching the bottom of it. He said, "All right, but be damn sure we chase him out of radar range before we enter the Gulf of Iskenderun."